The entire story of Pokemon Reborn up to the events of episode 17 will be summarized in this video, so obviously beware of spoilers. This video is primarily intended for Let's Players and more casual Reborn players who only play the game release to release and therefore have had, understandably, a difficult time remembering what this game is even about, what's going on, and generally putting the pieces together for a cohesive and coherent narrative experience. With that said, let's begin. The game begins with the player character on a train with Amethyst, the director of the Reborn League, heading to the Peridot Ward in Reborn City to start fresh and register for the League. Along the way, Amethyst informs the player about Reborn's environmental decline, which has led to a scarcity of available Pokemon within the city and the surrounding region. However, right after arriving in Peridot, the train explodes, leaving the player and Amethyst as the sole survivors. The player and Amethyst meet Julia, Reborn's hyperactive first gym leader, specializing in electric types, immediately after the player regains consciousness outside the station. Amethyst concludes that someone deliberately attacked the train before heading to the Grand Hall in Opal Ward to register the player and have them pick a starter. Inside the Grand Hall, the player is introduced to Cain, the mischievous and flamboyant poison type specialist, and Victoria, the righteous fighting type specialist, each representing friendly rivals for the player. Meanwhile, Amethyst interrogates the prime suspect of the train bombing, and it is revealed that he is a member of Team Meteor, the primary antagonist of the entire game. The player then runs into Fern, the grass-type specialist outside an abandoned factory in Peridot Ward. He is a loud-mouthed, cocky douchebag who is also sibling to the robot-like Florinia, Reborn's second gym leader. After defeating him, the player searches for Julia to issue a challenge, only to find her with Florinia and Fern preparing to bust a Team Meteor operation within the abandoned factory. The four trainers drive out Team Meteor from the factory, which they were using to pollute Reborn's waters, but not before being threatened by one of Team Meteor's executives overseeing the entire operation, Sirius. After defeating Julia and receiving their first badge, Florinia deems the player capable enough to assist her and Amaria, Reborn's water-type gym leader, in their effort to investigate the crisis involving giant plants and vines overrunning Reborn City's other wards and displacing its citizens. Afterwards, the player heads down to the Coral Ward and finds Amaria attempting to rescue Apophyll from Reborn's toxic waters, only for Cain to show up and successfully manage it with his Grimer. Cain then uses his new Pokemon in a friendly battle with the player shortly after rescuing it. As it turns out, Team Meteor is responsible for this calamity as well, via the use of what is called a Pulse Machine, which forcibly enhances a Pokemon's capabilities far beyond their usual limits, but greatly harming them in the process. In this case, Team Meteor used Pulse-enhanced Tangrout to cause destruction in Obsidia, Jasper, and Beryl wards. In the process of foiling Team Meteor in each of these districts, the player defeats two of their admins, Zell, a person who is actually three people stuck inside of one body, and the morally conflicted Taka. In between saving Obsidia and saving Beryl, the player visits the Apophyll Academy, which is the alma mater of Fern, Florinia, Julia, and Amaria, as well as a couple other gym leaders the player hasn't met yet at this point. There they challenge and defeat Florinia for their second badge. During the campaign to save Beryl Ward, the player runs into a young pink-haired girl named Heather who complains about her father's strictness and then flies off on her Salamence to defeat Team Meteor by herself. Her father turns out to be the stoic and cynical Corey, Reborn's poison-type gym leader. Depending on the player's actions, they can choose to expose Corey as a Team Meteor agent in front of Heather during their campaign in Beryl. Either way though, Corey retreats to his gym where the player defeats him. However, instead of receiving a badge from him, Corey explains that he joined Team Meteor as part of a bargain to keep a ruby ring that he had once given to his late wife as an engagement ring. So Team Meteor, specifically Sirius if you read Corey's diary later, murdered his wife during Heather's delivery in order to steal the ring, and Corey ended up joining them later in desperation to get it back and pass it on to Heather. Corey asks the player to look after Heather, who will be hunted by Team Meteor for her ring, before committing suicide by jumping off of Beryl Bridge down to Lapis Ward below. Before the player has any time to take all of this in, a loud rumbling noise is heard from the direction of Lapis Ward, prompting the player and Fern, who has just arrived on the scene, to go investigate. On their way to Lapis, the player discovers that a portion of the Grand Stairway connecting Opal and Lapis Ward has been blown up, revealing a cavern below. The authorities swarm the bomb site, so any attempt at investigation is futile right now, so the player proceeds to Lapis Ward instead. The first thing the player notices in Lapis Ward is a huge towering building near the center with a violet-haired woman outside of its door. muttering to herself about someone finally escaping. Reading the sign in front of the building informs you that this is Dr. Connell's orphanage, and it's locked. So the player moves on to where Corey should have landed, where Victoria is present consoling the meek, bug-type gym leader Shelly after they both witness Corey's fate. Suddenly, an ethereal-looking phantom, literally named Shade, and apparently also the ghost gym leader, appears to take Corey's remains away. After escorting Shelly back to her gym and expressing concern over her well-being, Victoria takes off for the Grand Stairway, naturally suspecting Team Meteor's involvement. The player follows her, this time able to reach the damaged portion of the stairway, and navigates their way through a shockingly elaborate series of crystal caverns and tunnels below, until they reach a narrow chamber with a large, ornate, yet odd-looking gate in the center, and where Victoria is being cornered by Team Meteor. However, before reaching Victoria, the player is stopped in front of the gate by a mysterious and imposing-looking man in a trench coat who rants about the ignorance of those living in Reborn City above and reprimanding them for burying this chamber. Here we learn why Corey's ruby ring was so coveted, because the man then explains that the gate in front of him is opened by 4 keys: ruby, amethyst, emerald, and sapphire. The man claims that once he has opened this gate with the 4 keys, that beauty can be restored to the world, free of Reborn City's filth. However, after expositing all of this, the man leaves and lets you continue towards Victoria, and the two of you defeat her captors from Team Meteor before returning to Shelly's gym. Victoria once again worries for Shelly, explaining that Shelly was friends with Heather and that seeing Heather's father die in front of her must have distressed her greatly. Victoria suggests a visit to Dr. Connell's, known both for running the orphanage and being a psychiatrist who could help Shelly. So the player makes their way back to the orphanage to seek Dr. Connell's help, only to suddenly see a pink-haired woman storm out of the orphanage, seemingly relieved to leave. The door is left unlocked for the player to enter and be greeted by 2 black-haired children, the twins Anna and Noelle, each clutching a Pokemon doll of Jirachi and Cleffa respectively. Anna tells the player that the woman who just left was Laura, and left because she just turned 18. Anna then introduces the player to Laura's younger sister, the hot-tempered Charlotte. The 3 orphans explain that Dr. Connell has refused to let any of them leave until they become legal adults, and warn the player against letting Shelly come here, saying that the doctor uses electric-type Pokemon for cruel electroconvulsive therapy. Shortly after this though, Dr. Sigmund Connell himself appears and asks why the player is here. Anna lies and it says that the player is here to challenge Noelle and Charlotte, who are both gym leaders. So Connell explains to the player that the orphanage is ill-suited for such battles and that the children are quote-unquote still volatile, so they cannot leave, before escorting the player out. After telling what happened in the orphanage to Victoria and Shelly, Shelly says that she's worried for Heather and that she wants to find her, but honors the player's request for a gym battle before that. The player defeats Shelly for their 3rd badge, and then Shelly goes on to explain that every gym leader in Reborn has a reserve leader behind them in case the current one becomes unavailable, and that essentially means that the player will need to battle the reserve poison-type gym leader since Corey died before giving them a badge. The player heads back to Grand Hall to report Corey's death to Amethyst, only to find that Fern beat them to it. Fern reveals that the poison-type gym leader resides in Bisbean Wasteland and will require a certain key to enter. Fern offers to tell them how to get a key in exchange for a battle, which the player of course wins. Afterwards, Fern says to get the key from the poison-type gym leader's brother, who he recalls as a fruity-looking freak wearing fishnets and decked out in purple. Fern is describing Kane. The player eventually finds Kane in Beryl Cemetery visiting Corey's grave. Kane explains that he's concerned about Corey's young daughter that he left behind, and resolves himself to look after her himself in his place. He also agrees to give the player the key to the wasteland, in exchange for another battle of course. Kane is once again defeated, but before Kane can give the player the key, Heather shows up at the graveyard herself. Kane expresses his concern for her and implores her to go see Shelly and give her ease of mind. Heather snaps back that she can take care of herself, but agrees to visit Shelly before once again taking off on her Salamence. The player then returns to Lapis Ward to check in on Shelly and Heather and finds Kane there with them as well. Heather proceeds to argue with Heather and Kane over them trying to look after her before storming off and running into Dr. Connell and a couple of his orderlies. Kane, Shelly, and the player follow after her, only for Connell to insist on taking in Heather, claiming to be compelled by law after Shelly lets it slip that she's an orphan now, in addition to being underage. After hearing screams from the top floor of the orphanage not long after Connell took Heather, Kane, Shelly, and the player resolve to break into the orphanage and free her. The trio literally bust into the orphanage with their Pokemon, and with the guidance of the other 3 orphans, they all reach the top floor to interrupt Connell's electroshock therapy session. Charlotte, now having retrieved her Pokemon from the doctor, threatens him with force, prompting Connell to reluctantly release Heather, who has been oddly silent, but also warning that he'll be calling the authorities on the group. The entire group, now consisting of Kane, Heather, Shelly, Noelle, Anna, Charlotte, and the player, are all on the run now and decide to flee Reborn City altogether into the Chrysalia region, where Laura can provide them refuge according to Charlotte. As it turns out, the fastest way to Chrysalia from Reborn City is through the unused underground rail net, where the entire group is brought to a halt by an electronic gate due to the rail net lacking power. By this point, the entire group, but particularly Kane, note Heather's silence and conclude it's the result of Connell's traumatic therapy. Shelly advises the player to seek Shade out, since he's the one in charge of the power plant and can open the gate. Of course, he's also a gym leader, so the player can get a badge from him as well. However, Connell had anticipated that Charlotte would attempt to go to her sister and witnesses them all head into the railnet from above. He quits his pursuit before reaching the railnet himself, but is suddenly offered help from a familiar foe, Sirius of Team Meteor, who seems to have a high opinion of the Doctor and believes they can help each other, likely in reference to Heather's ring. The player departs from the group and goes back to Beryl Ward to reach the power plant where Shade is waiting for them. The player defeats Shade and receives their 4th badge. Shade also restores power to the railnet, which opens up the electronic gate that Kane and the others are in front of, only to reveal that Team Meteor was waiting on the other side with Sirius commanding them. Team Meteor ends up abducting everyone in the group except for Kane, and Kane only manages to escape by blocking off part of the railnet with an attack from his Nidoking. By the time the player returns to the railnet, the only person there waiting for them is Victoria, who was informed of the situation by Kane and had come to investigate a way to pursue Team Meteor past the debris and fissures that Kane had caused during his escape. She concludes that the only way to proceed further into the railnet now is to have a Pokemon use Strength to move the debris. However, the player still needs another badge to use Strength and doesn't even have the TM for it in the first place, so Victoria suggests that the two of them make their way to her alma mater, the Apophyll Academy, located across Azurine Lake outside of Reborn City, in order to have the player challenge her teacher, who will provide them with another badge and can also give them access to Strength. She also explains that Kane has already taken off in that direction since his poison types can help him cross the toxic water of Azurine Lake. Hoping to catch Kane before he leaves Reborn City, the player races to Coral Ward, but it is too late to stop him from going by himself. The player runs into Amaria almost immediately after watching Kane depart, and she explains that in order to safely take a ferry from Reborn to Apophyll, they'll need to stop the pollution of Azurine Lake first. Amaria claims to have already found the source of this pollution and asks the player to help her stop it. Amaria leads the player to another abandoned factory in Peridot Ward, where she believes Team Meteor is running another pollution operation. She uses her Lapras to help her and the player bust into the factory, where the pair are separated by a swarm of Team Meteor mooks shortly after infiltrating. And as the player is looking for a way to shut the factory down by themselves, the mysterious man from below the Grand Stairway suddenly appears again and ambushes the player, pulling a trapdoor leading to a caged area with captive Pokemon. The player escapes with the help of these Pokemon and makes their way to the source of the pollution, where they find the mysterious man in the trench coat and Zell operating a pulse-enhanced muck that's likely the cause of the water pollution in Azurine. The man standing next to Zell then sends out a Garchomp and attempts to straight up kill the player, but is saved by Amaria and her Kingdra. Amaria faces off against the mysterious man while the player fights Zell and his pulse muck. Amaria questions the motivations of the man she's battling as she recounts Team Meteor's previous deeds, and the man responds that they're essentially trying to get everyone to leave Reborn City by making the living conditions miserable, and that they blew up the train in order to keep more people from coming here. The man also takes interest in Amaria's sapphire bracelet, which prompts her to retort that she has no intention of letting him take it since it was a gift from her significant other, Titania. After losing to us, Zell apologizes to his superior in the trenchcoat, identifying him as Solaris. Amaria also seems to have fended off Solaris, prompting Team Meteor to retreat, but not before he has his Tyranitar sucker punch Amaria on his way out. Amaria, winded and wounded, limps her way out of the factory, stating that now the water treatment center can restore the lake given some time. Before going their separate ways, Amaria lends the player the key to her personal boat and states that she's going back home to Ametrine north of Reborn City. The player, now with a means to cross the lake, heads back to Coral Ward, then to Apophyll Academy at last. On their way to the Academy building itself, the player encounters the very gym leader they'll have to fight, giving a lecture outside. Kiki, the fighting-type gym leader and sensei of Apophyll, welcomes the player as a student before Victoria arrives and explains the urgency of their situation. Kiki agrees to let the player be tested for graduation immediately, as that is a requirement to challenge her for strength. The test involves climbing a nearby volcano, Mount Pyrus, and challenging one of Kiki's best students, the brooding former fire-type gym leader Cal. Before being defeated, Cal asks if the player has met Shelly and if she's doing well, explaining that the two had a falling out that he regrets. After defeating Cal, the player goes back to the academy to finally get their 5th badge, only to be stopped by Victoria, who explains that Kiki is terminally ill and shouldn't be exerting herself in battles. Kiki stubbornly takes the player's challenge anyway, prompting Victoria to battle the player herself to keep them from battling Kiki. The player defeats both Victoria and then Kiki, but before receiving a badge, Kiki faints from exhaustion. As Kiki is recovering in her chambers, Victoria points out that Kane is nowhere to be found despite departing before either her or the player. She asks the player to go look for Kane and potentially rescue him, prompting the player to head to an island in between Reborn and Apophyll, Ametrine Island. It turns out Kane had a run-in with Team Meteor on his way to Apophyll and got himself kidnapped on the island. Here the player meets Taka again, who conspicuously reveals Team Meteor's latest scheme, involving causing Mount Pyrus to erupt with a pulse camerupt, then offering only mild resistance before retreating and letting the player free Kane. Kane and the player then return to Apophyll to warn Victoria and Kiki about Team Meteor's plan, and decide that Kane, Victoria, and the player will all go to Mount Pyrus to back up Cal and foil Team Meteor's plans in Kiki's place due to her condition. Kane races ahead of Victoria and the player, but eventually the trio all reach the top of Mount Pyrus after fighting through Team Meteor mooks along the way. However, by the time Victoria and the player catch up to Kane, Taka and Solaris have already defeated both him and Cal, as well as installed the pulse camerupt. Victoria proceeds to engage Taka, who informs the group that Solaris is actually his father. Solaris then proceeds to battle the player and taunts that he can defeat them with a single Pokemon, his signature Garchomp. Regardless of how the player's battle with Solaris goes, the showdown is interrupted by Kiki arriving onto the scene, despite Victoria's insistence that she stay behind. Kiki commands her Medicham to jump across a pool of lava to where the pulse machine is in order to destroy it while Solaris and Taka are busy, only to be caught by Cal's McMotor in sudden betrayal. Before anyone can react, Solaris tells Cal to dispose of Medicham, prompting McMotor to toss it into the lava below. Almost immediately afterwards, Solaris takes advantage of Kiki's initial shock and orders Garchomp to kill her, which it successfully does. Disgusted by Solaris' zealousness and stammering that this wasn't part of their agreement, Cal then destroys the pulse machine himself in defiance. Solaris merely taunts Cal in response with the assertion that Cal's older brother, Blake, was right about him being weak, before signaling a retreat for Team Meteor, leaving Cal behind. He then tries to apologize to Victoria and explain his actions in vain as Victoria angrily orders him to leave. In the aftermath of the bittersweet victory over Team Meteor, Victoria assumes the mantle of Sensei and gives the player strength, but warns them that they still need another badge to use it since Kiki never gave hers before her demise. Kane and the player make their way back to Reborn to open the way into the wasteland and towards Aya's gym. After opening the gate to Bisbean, Kane leaves with a railnet to wait until the player is ready, likely due to not wanting to face his sister himself. The player then travels across the wasteland to the only building in decent condition, a normal-looking house that sticks out in the bizarre-looking toxic wasteland. Inside, the player meets Kane's mother, who explains that Aya is occupied with another trainer at the moment. As it turns out, that trainer is Fern, who characteristically gloats after his victory over the new poison-type gym leader, the rather insecure and introverted Aya. Right as Fern is about to challenge the player, a red-haired young man enters the gym and introduces himself as Hardy, the strong-willed and optimistic rock-type gym leader. He says that he's here to welcome the new gym leader and agrees to mediate the player's battle with Aya, and also attempts to reassure her after she loses to them and hands over the player's 5th badge. After her loss, Aya reveals that Kane was supposed to be the reserve gym leader instead of her, but ran away from home before he had the chance to fulfill his duty, contrary to one of Kane's earlier claims that he was kicked out. Upon returning to Reborn City, Cal approaches the player and desperately explains that he had planned to double-cross Team Meteor all along, and that the pulse machine on Mount Pyrus was sabotaged by him from the start. He laments Kiki's death before leaving. After meeting back up with Kane in the underground railnet, Kane admits that Aya told the truth, but adds that the reason he ran away was because his mother didn't approve of his sexual preferences, as it should be noted that Kane is canonically pansexual. The player proceeds to use strength to get past the debris in the underground railnet and continue with Kane to the abandoned Yureyu Corporation building up ahead, where Kane has determined Team Meteor and Dr. Connell have taken refuge with Shelly and the orphans. Inside, Kane and the player team up to rescue Shelly, Noelle, and Charlotte from Team Meteor, along the way learning that Yureyu was once a huge company of Reborn that suffered heavily during a series of natural disasters some years ago, especially earthquakes, which destroyed this particular building. At least that was the common belief, but in reality, Team Meteor now claims to have been behind Yureyu's downfall. The demise of Yureyu at the hands of Team Meteor started a domino effect, leading to the complete devastation of Reborn's economy. Having rescued the aforementioned three, Kane and the player proceed to the top 2 floors to find Heather and Anna. They find Heather being guarded by Dr. Connell, and the player can either choose to fight him here or proceed to the next floor and fight Sirius instead, who is in the process of taking another one of the 4 keys, revealed to be in the ownership of Anna, the Amethyst Pendant. Regardless of who the player chooses to fight, Team Meteor and Dr. Connell make out with both the Ruby Ring and Amethyst Pendant, but in turn the party escapes with the rescued orphans and finally arrive in Chrysolia as originally intended. As soon as the group exits the railnet, Heather immediately abandons the group without a word on her salamence, prompting Kane to separate from the group as well to chase after her. The rest of the group, now consisting of Shelly, Noelle, Anna, Charlotte, and the player, continue towards Laura's residence, especially after realizing that Anna has fallen ill. The group travels through a portion of Tanzan Mountain before entering a cove, with Laura's house finally in sight. Upon arriving, Laura is shocked to see the orphans away from the orphanage, prompting Charlotte to explain to her sister the situation at hand. Laura agrees to let the group take refuge in their family's house, and advises the player to visit Spinal Town nearby to pick up medicine for Anna. The player travels to Spinal Town only to be witness to a bizarre crisis affecting the town. Stuff in the town is being randomly teleported away and sometimes will reappear just as randomly. Anything ranging from chairs and small furniture to people and entire buildings. Inconveniently, the Pokemart where the player could buy medicine gets teleported onto a manor which is apparently home to another gym leader. Upon approaching the manor, a spiky-haired boy with glasses comes out desperately searching for someone named Luna, before realizing that the Pokemart is now on top of his house. Shortly after, his mother, the Ice-type gym leader Sarah, comes out to see for herself before inviting the player inside. Once inside their manor, the boy introduces himself as Bennett, a bug-type enthusiast. He then explains that another gym leader, Luna, was living with them as Sarah's adopted daughter after she suddenly appeared before them, and recently disappeared just as suddenly. He describes Luna as a blonde with a black and white dress and tells the player to be on the lookout for her. The conversation is interrupted by someone at the door who Bennett lets in. He's a white-robed, middle-aged man with grayish-white hair who goes by the name of L, and he describes himself as a devout follower of Arceus and also claims to be looking for his daughter Luna. Sarah offers to let L stay a while given that Luna was recently here, and also invites him and Bennett to spectate her gym battle with the player. Before facing Sarah herself, however, Bennett challenges the player, expressing that he wants to become a gym leader someday too. Despite Bennett losing, L seems to recognize his talent and tells him that he should aim even higher, towards the Elite Four. The player then defeats Sarah for their 6th badge, but during their battle, L and Bennett decide to leave the arena and step outside the manor. After the battle is over, we are shown L and Bennett's conversation outside. L offers to introduce him to the Elite Four in exchange for further information on Luna that he hasn't already let on. Bennett complies and mentions that Luna might be headed towards a place called Vanhanen Castle. L expresses slight annoyance at mention of that place before asking if she still carried the emerald brooch that he had given her. Bennett answers that she did, which pleases L, and the two decide to immediately depart, giving Bennett no opportunity to say goodbye to Sarah. Despite this, Sarah expresses joy that new doors are opening for Bennett, but also laments having been left alone by both Luna and now Bennett. By the time the player leaves Sarah's manor, the Pokemon has been teleported somewhere else and they eventually find it near the Tanzan Mountain entrance, finally obtaining Anna's medicine. On the player's way to the cove, the region around Tanzan Mountain begins experiencing tremors. Upon returning to Laura's place in Tanzan Cove, Anna, feeling better, suggests that the player battle Noelle for their 7th badge. Noelle reluctantly complies, but before the battle can even commence, Charlotte notices her other sister, the woman that the player saw back at the orphanage, the violet-haired Dragon Gym leader Saphira, racing towards them atop her Dragonite. Saphira warns the party that Team Meteor and Dr. Connell are both headed their way. Team Meteor is making their way across the cove in small boats, while the Doctor and his orderlies are going around the water on foot, cutting off any potential escape routes. Saphira takes off again to fend off the majority of Team Meteor's forces, while the rest of the group take up defensive positions in the house to defend the orphans from Connell and anyone who makes it past Saphira. Laura, who is revealed to be part of the Elite Four, guards the upper floor with Anna and Noelle, while the player serves as the first line of defense downstairs, with Shelly and Charlotte hiding nearby. The Tanzan Cove house raid can go a number of ways depending on the player's decisions, and whether they chose to fight Sirius or Dr. Connell in the Yureyu building earlier. But ultimately, Team Meteor and Dr. Connell end up kidnapping at least one person in the group and taking them to their base in Tanzan Mountain to lure the others in, with the idea being to snuff out the last source of resistance to Team Meteor in Chrysolia, and also fulfilling their end of the bargain with Dr. Connell. Depending on who was kidnapped, the player takes off to rescue them with either Laura or Saphira. The player, either with Saphira or both Saphira and Laura, make it to the end of Team Meteor's base, where Sirius, Dr. Connell, and Zell are attempting to tame a pulse-enhanced Abra, which is revealed to be the source of Spinal Town's teleportation catastrophe. Team Meteor plan to use Abra to teleport themselves past the gate under Reborn City, instead of using the 4 keys, but haven't been able to control Abra. Sirius reveals that Solaris isn't actually the big boss of Team Meteor, at least not anymore, but instead a woman named Lynn who is due to arrive at any moment to check on the operation. Before the party can attack the Team Meteor admins, Abra teleports them all away, deep underground in some tunnels below Tanzan Mountain, where the tremors that the player experienced much earlier are much stronger. Eventually the player finds the source of all the tremors, a giant Steelix that Team Meteor had been disturbing by building a base in Tanzan Mountain. Saphira humorously tames the Steelix and uses it as a mount, intending to have it bust into the Team Meteor base where the cells are so she can free whoever Team Meteor kidnapped, or if she was the one kidnapped, she'll escort Laura home instead. Meanwhile, the player finds their way back to where Zell, Connell, and Sirius are and defeats the Pulse Abra, but Lynn arrives soon after to Sirius and Zell's horror. Lynn bluntly demands a status report, which Sirius gives, explaining that the Abra project is ultimately a failure. The player is introduced by Sirius as a new recruit in order to avoid her wrath, but she quickly realizes that Sirius is lying. Before Sirius can protest, Lynn demands to know who Dr. Connell is, and Connell introduces himself in response. Connell asks Lynn if they've met before, but Lynn denies this. Sirius appeals to Lynn by explaining that Connell helped them obtain Ruby and Amethyst, also mentioning that Solaris has a lead on Sapphire and that Elias, most likely referring to El, is pursuing Emerald. Before Lynn can get another word in, a Team Meteor grunt rushes in to warn the admins about a giant Steelix wreaking havoc on the rest of the base. Lynn responds by saying she'll take care of it before making her exit. Lynn, atop her Hydreigon, flies towards Steelix and Saphira. Lynn calls out to Saphira by name, but Saphira does not seem to recognize her back, asking who she is and if they've met before. However, Lynn ignores her questions and instead taunts that she won't be able to protect her family even if she defeats Team Meteor before blasting Saphira out of the sky. Sirius, somewhat demoralized, orders the player to leave before Lynn comes back. The player returns to the sisters' home where Shelly, Saphira's sisters, and the orphan twins are discussing Saphira's fate. Charlotte is optimistic about the current status of her sister, but Noelle remains convinced that there's no way Saphira managed to survive, falling off of Steelix near the mountain's peak. The player tells the group about their run-in with Lynn and the Meteor admins, prompting Shelly to mention a story about an ancient city building a temple around a meteor and sealing it with 4 keys. Shelly and the rest of the group put the pieces together and conclude that the ancient city became reborn, Anna and Heather's jewelry are 2 of the keys, and that the temple is what Team Meteor found by blowing up the Grand Stairway. The whole group resolves to keep Team Meteor from opening the temple. Charlotte then asks Laura if she has any idea where her sapphire bracelet is, but Laura laments that it may not have survived the house fire that killed their parents. Upset at mention of the incident, Charlotte leaves, and Laura explains that Charlotte believes she's accidentally responsible for the fire. Later, it is highly implied that Sirius was actually responsible, in pursuit of the 4 keys undoubtedly. Laura leaves to calm Charlotte down. The player then finally battles Noelle for their 7th badge. After the battle, Laura returns and says Charlotte is fine but needs some time alone. Suddenly, another tremor shocks the party, but this time it's from Team Meteor's base on the mountain, exploding according to Anna. At this point, the player makes their departure from the party and travels back into Tanzan Mountain to investigate, only to run into Saphira, who has survived her encounter with Lynn, and actually return to the Meteor base to destroy it. She also reveals that she managed to retrieve the ruby ring and amethyst pendant along the way, and gives both to the player, explaining that Team Meteor is much more likely to search for them with their original owners than with them. She also tells the player that she plans to relocate her sisters, Shelly and the twins, to Labradora and Calcinon, the cities where her and Charlotte are gym leaders, before leaving the player to their own devices. The player continues through Tanzan Mountain towards Route 1 in Adventuring, where they run into Fern. Of course, he wants to battle, but also mentions the existence of a gym to the east of Route 1 inside a huge castle, and also that the guards to a gate city to the north are perpetually asleep. After beating Fern again, the player makes their way to the castle Fern mentioned, Vanhanen Castle. Inside, the player is greeted by a blonde girl with a black and white dress, who must be the Dark-type gym leader Luna, who assumes the role of the castle's maid. Luna then introduces them to the person she calls her father, the eccentric, psychic-type gym leader Radamis, and his talking Gardevoir known for being a television anchor, Gossip Gardevoir. Radamis eagerly accepts the player's challenge and asks Gardevoir and Luna to excuse themselves. However, Radamis only did this to explain to the player that he knows they've met the man claiming to be Luna's biological father, L, and to clarify that although Luna insists on calling Radamis her father after suddenly appearing, that he is in fact not. Though he also reveals that L has already come to reclaim her on multiple occasions, but he's refused him, suspecting prior abuse. Luna then returns and informs Radamis that another challenger has arrived, and Kane enters, greeting the player. Kane explains that he found Heather in Ametrine City, and that she was adopted by a man named Blake. Satisfied at this turn of events, Kane decided to return to his league challenge alongside the player. Radamis then proposes that the 2 challengers battle each other to decide who gets a shot at him first. The player defeats Kane, but before they can proceed to battle Radamis, Luna discovers a message that informs Radamis that his Gardevoir, who has been conspicuously missing ever since Radamis dismissed her, has been captured by none other than L, and to return her daughter to him in exchange for his Pokemon. Despite Radamis' proposal that the group do nothing, Kane angrily insists that they go after L and Gardevoir before leaving to do so himself. Radamis still has no intention of going to save Gardevoir until Luna asks him to do so, after which he complies and heads outside to where Kane is. The player, Kane, and Radamis then go off in search of L, despite Radamis insisting it's a waste of time, and find him on the other side of Route 1 inside the Grand Gates, which lead back to Reborn City. L spots the player first and flees from them into a compartment where the gate's gears are. Radamis explains that the gate hasn't been operational for years and has remained perpetually shut, but because entry to a gate is currently barred as well, L had no other place to hide. Radamis, Kane, and the player pursue L, only for them to fall down into the same crystal caverns that Team Meteor uncovered when they blew up the Grand Stairway on the other side. The trio follow the cavern's depths until arriving to a much more ample and fertile looking space with oddly sophisticated ruins, including a tower adorning it. Here the group finds Gossip Gardevoir, accompanied by a silver-haired person named Adrian. Adrian is initially hostile to the party because Elle had already met them and told them that Radamis brainwashed his daughter and also neglected Gardevoir. Gardevoir seems to corroborate Adrian's claims, before also claiming that the player has stolen Elle's property, referring to the 2 keys in their possession. Gardevoir then forcefully takes the amethyst pendant from the player, causing Kane to step in to prevent it from happening to the other key as well, protesting that the pendant belongs to Anna. Radamis also seems to recognize the pendant upon its mention. Adrian and Gardevoir then leave to presumably meet up with Elle. Kane and the player, now somewhat skeptical of Radamis, follow Gardevoir through the mysterious tower, which requires at least one of the 4 keys to progress. Because the player had the ruby ring and it's still in their possession, they can use it to reach the top where Gardevoir and Elle are. Along the way, the group runs into Adrian again, where they explain that they identify neither as a man or woman, to Kane's amusement. Adrian also states that he got stuck here while inspecting the Grand Gates about an hour ago. Radamis shows Adrian Elle's ransom note, causing them to become skeptical of both parties instead of just Radamis. Elle, Kane, the player, Radames, Adrian, and Gardevoir all arrive near the top of the tower, where Elle is inspecting a gate very similar to the one Solaris was in front of under the Grand Stairway. Elle refers to it as the innermost sanctum, and that just as he suspected, he's missing keys in order to open it. Elle exposits about what's beyond the gates, and explains that it's the site of a meteor landing, and that it houses the Lord, presumably Arceus. Radames simply mocks Elle's antics, causing Elle to reprimand Radames' apparent treatment of both Luna and Gardevoir, while the latter continues to express their distaste for Radames, and Radames continues to act apathetically to the entire situation. Here, the player is given a choice whether to believe Elle's version of the events or continue to side with Radames. But regardless of the player's decision, Radames then proceeds to expose Elle's fakery and reveals that the Gardevoir in front of him is actually Elle's Ditto. Radames then expresses either satisfaction or disappointment that the player did or did not recognize that the Ditto behaved completely differently from the real Gossip Gardevoir, depending on the player's earlier choice. Driven into a corner, Elle transforms Ditto into the entity beyond the gate, an Arceus, which the player then attempts to defeat. It should be noted that if the player sided with Elle, they don't have to actually defeat the Ditto Arceus, but they do if siding with Radames. After the player's battle with the Ditto Arceus, the real Gossip Gardevoir appears and puts Elle to sleep. After the conflicts end, the entire group retreats back to the Grand Gates, which suddenly begin to open after years of being shut. However, before the player exits the cavern with the tower, an unidentified voice tells them to come back and play with them again. Adrian, Gardevoir, Elle, Radames, Kane, and the player emerge from the gates into Reborn City. Adrian, however, is in complete disbelief upon entering the rotting city, stating that it's nothing like the Reborn City that they once lived in. Adrian then runs off to check on their gym, extremely worried almost to the point of panic. The rest of the group follows them to Coral Ward, where Adrian is staring at the ruins of a gym. Based on Adrian's statements, the amount of time the Grand Gates were shut, and the condition of their gym, Radames concludes that Adrian was frozen in time under the Grand Gates for about a decade, and also that they were the cause of the Grand Gates' prior dysfunction. Adrian then leaves to consult with Amethyst in the Grand Hall while the rest of the group return to Vanhanen Castle for the players' gym battle. Back in Vanhanen Castle, Radames humorously reveals Elle, now going by Elias, and clearly under some kind of hypnosis, as his new butler. He then commands Elias to return the Amethyst pendant to him. The player engages Radames in the gym battle for their 8th badge, with Luna and Kane spectating. After their victory, Luna expresses interest in battling the player on her home turf of Iola Valley, but then suddenly the power goes out in Vanhanen Castle and the group all go their separate ways to investigate the cause. The player runs into Elias on their way out of Vanhanen, who assures them that they can escort them away from their assailants. However, by this point, Elias had already broken free of the trance Radames placed him under, and leads the player into a Team Meteor trap, having been in touch with Solaris about how much of a nuisance the player has been. Kane manages to surprise Elias in the Team Meteor mooks, and saves the player, trapping himself with Elias in Vanhanen Castle. Kane also deduces that Elias is in fact an Elite Four member, before engaging him. The player flees Vanhanen Castle and runs into Radames, who is disguised as a Team Meteor grunt, who then reveals an escape route for the player and tells them that Luna has been captured by Elias with Team Meteor's help. Radames directs the player towards the underworld of Reborn City, known as 7th Street, and Luna's most likely destination before departing. The player returns to Reborn and makes their way to 7th Street via one of the gangs around Lapis Ward, and manages to spot Bennett there, now in Arceus cultist attire, seemingly wandering around. The player eventually corners Bennett, who claims to also want to save Luna, and then tells them about Elias's base of operations in a sanctum under 7th Street, leaving the way open for them. The player enters the Sub-7 sanctum, only to find that Bennett lured them into a trap at Elias's request, and is quickly overwhelmed by Elias's legion of cultists and is imprisoned in the sanctum. A homeless prisoner next to the player's cell eventually uses his Klefki to free the player, and the player has to sneak and battle his way through Elias's cultists, to where Elias is preparing a ritual to apparently free Luna from Radames' brainwashing, although it's far more likely that it's actually meant to put Luna under Elias's control, since she holds the Emerald Brooch for him. Elias then uses Kane as a hostage to keep the player from interrupting his ritual. However, he's caught off guard by Radames disguised as one of his lackeys, and Gossip Gardevoir, somewhat comically, manages to teleport the cultists away and renders Bennett useless. Driven into a corner again, Elias decides to cut his losses and snatch the Emerald Brooch away from Luna before Gardevoir has the chance to teleport the party away together, successfully rescuing Luna in the end. Much later in the game, the player can return to the Sanctum and read Elias' diary, which gives context to his relationship with Solaris, explaining that Solaris' lineage were guardians of Arceus' Meteor, and that Elias' family served his, explaining how they know each other. Luna then invites the player to Iola Valley for a gym battle, and the player complies, making their way there through Radamus' estate. In Iola Valley, the player ends up driving off Bennett, who chose to pursue Luna to proclaim his love for her. Shortly after Luna rejects Bennett, the player finally gets to battle Luna for their 9th badge. After defeating Luna, the player meets up with Cain at the Agate City entrance, where, true to what Fern said, the guards are still asleep. Cain and the player decide to forcefully enter a gate and find Aya and Hardy there, also asleep and on the ground. Cain's confusion is interrupted by the bizarre and physics-defying jester Terra, Reborn's ground-type gym leader, who aggressively warns Cain and the player that anyone who lingers in Agate City for too long will fall asleep. She then proceeds to launch Aya and Hardy away from the city with a giant mallet, before escorting the player and Cain to Agate Circus, where most of the city's residents have taken refuge, after a mysterious radio signal put the entire city to sleep, corroborating what Terra told them. Cain and the player find Aya, still passed out under the care of Agate Circus's other 2 gym leaders who make up the Agate Circus Triumvirate with Terra. Ciel, the flying-type gym leader, and Samson, who recently replaced Kiki as the fighting-type leader. Aya wakes up and reunites with Cain. Meanwhile, the player is sent off to find Hardy, who landed somewhere in Route 2. During their search, the player comes across a place called Fior Mansion at the end of Route 2 near a mountain range. Inside, the player discovers that the mansion is owned by Amaria, who is still recovering from her encounter with Solaris, and her significant other, who also happens to be Hardy's older sister, Titania, the iron-willed and somewhat aloof Steel-type gym leader. After aggressively waking Hardy up, Titania, Hardy, and the player head downstairs to where Amaria is and overhear Gossip Gardevoir on TV. Gossip Gardevoir is reporting on what could be described as an all-out war that has erupted to the north of Aventurine. Saphira, her siblings, and the group of gym leaders that the player assisted during the events of the Tanzan Cove house raid comprise one side, while the forces of Team Meteor and Dr. Connell comprise the other side. According to the report, Team Meteor has seized Labrador City and erected a barrier around the city with the help of a Pulse Mr. Mime, while Saphira's forces are residing in neighboring Calcinon City. At this point in the game, the easiest way to keep track of Reborn's massive cast is to sort them into 2 separate groups, the Onyx Academy kids and the Orphanage breakouts. These 2 groups encompass the majority of the important characters and gym leaders. In my mind, the Onyx Academy group consists of Julia, Fern, Florinia, Amaria, Titania, Hardy, and to some extent, Aya. The Orphanage group, I think, consists of Saphira, Laura, Charlotte, Anna, Noelle, Heather, Shelly, and to some extent Cain, and this is the group currently fighting Team Meteor and Calcinon. This is important to keep in mind now because up until this point, these groups have been fighting Team Meteor mostly parallel to each other, but are about to truly intersect for the first time, and so this quick recap will make it a lot less confusing to remember who is already supposed to know who when the 2 groups start running into each other. Coming back from that tangent, upon seeing the TV report, Amaria and Hardy become set on assisting the resistance effort in Calcinon against Team Meteor, but Titania, likely influenced by Amaria's injury, insists that they have no reason to become involved, and would be pointlessly endangering themselves. Hardy then leaves for the circus to check in on Aya. Amaria also points out that Team Meteor is after her Sapphire bracelet anyway, prompting her to ask Titania where she even found it, due to neither of them knowing why Team Meteor wants the bracelet or what it even actually is. Titania goes on to explain that she had discovered Tanzan Cove on a whim, likely only a short period after the house fire that killed the orphan sister's parents, because Titania describes finding the bracelet in a pile of ashes across the water. Titania then warns the player that if they want to head to Calcinon, they'll need to surf their way through Celestinine Mountain, which she has the TM for, and another gym badge. So the player heads back to the circus to challenge one of the Triumvirate, Samson, and defeats him for their 10th badge. After defeating Samson, Terra tells the player and the gym leaders present that the sleep-inducing signal is coming from Ametrine, prompting Aya, Cain, and Hardy to head out for Ametrine as well as Calcinon. The player, however, returns to Fior Mansion first to receive Surf from Titania, who is writing in her diary when the player walks in. She notices the player and goes to retrieve Surf for them. The player can choose whether or not to read Titania's diary, which reveals that she's been faking her love for Amaria in order to keep her from falling back into depression. Regardless, Titania comes back and gives the player a surf before asking them if they were reading the diary. Again, regardless of the player's answer, Titania makes the player swear to keep the information of the diary to themselves, especially from Amaria, who has just walked in to overhear Titania say that last part. Amaria then grills the player over what Titania is hiding, and the player can either spill the beans, or Amaria just rushes to the diary and reads it herself, sending her into despair either way. After Titania admits to the contents of the diary, Amaria storms out of the mansion with Titania chasing after her, and the player finds them both at the edge of a waterfall near Tanzan Mountain. Titania tries desperately to keep Amaria from doing anything rash, but fails to keep Amaria from jumping off the waterfall into Reborn's water treatment center below, prompting Titania to warn the player that they'd better come back for her, before jumping off the waterfall herself, hoping to save Amaria. The player then heads into Tanzan Mountain to catch up to Aya, Kane, and Hardy, only to find them gawking at a giant ice pyramid blocking the way to Ametrine City. The player explains the events of the waterfall, and Kane points out that the TM for Waterfall needed to rescue Titania and Amaria is also being held somewhere in Ametrine. Additionally, Hardy grimly tells the party that the ice is blocking Ametrine's only access route to the rest of the world, and due to the arid climate there, they have to import all their food, leading Hardy to conclude that the city will eventually starve with this ice structure blocking off access. The party decides to head to Calcenon first after all, to enlist the help of the other leaders fighting Team Meteor and dealing with the ice. After emerging from the mountain into Route 3, Hardy states that Calcenon is just around the corner, but right before the player manages to reach the south entrance to the city, the path leading up to that entrance is destroyed in the crossfire between Saphira and a pulse Clawitzer that Meteor is commanding. Saphira then descends to briefly tell the party that they can use the eastern entrance to Calcenon before taking off again. The group races towards the eastern entrance, given that they've essentially wandered into a war zone, only for the group to get separated by another Clawitzer blast that destroyed a bridge that Kane and Hardy had already crossed, but Aya and the player had not. This forces the party to split up, with Kane and Hardy agreeing to continue ahead, while Aya and the player are forced to enter a cavern littered with Team Meteor mooks in order to travel around the destroyed bridge and emerge near the eastern entrance. However, Aya and the player wander off course and accidentally discover that Team Meteor hit a small base deep within the cavern, and that this base is actually the one controlling Pulse Clawitzer. There they fight two high-ranking Team Meteor members guarding the controls and win, prompting one of them to quit Team Meteor altogether and shut down the Pulse Clawitzer's power source in frustration. However, before she can leave the scene, Sirius arrives and kills her with a chandelure. He then attempts to kill the player immediately after, only to be saved by Aya pushing us out of the way, giving Sirius the opportunity to take her hostage and leave with her. The player eventually arrives in Calcenon City, where Hardy greets them at the entrance and tells them that Kane went off to see his old friends, referring to the Orphanage breakout group. The player informs Hardy of what happened to Aya, causing him to storm off to confront Team Meteor at the barrier separating Calcenon and Labradora. The player then goes to the house where Shelly, Noelle, Anna, and Kane have all met up to inform Kane about Aya. Kane seems mostly calm about the situation, saying that Aya can take care of herself. The orphans then question Kane about Heather, and Kane tells the group about her being adopted by Blake. Shelly, knowing of Blake via Cal, worries for her friend because she's heard nothing but negative things about Blake. She then resolves to go to Ametrine to check on her, only for Kane to interject and inform her that the path is being blocked by ice. Anna then comes up with the idea to simply dive under the ice to get through, and advises the player to challenge Charlotte since they're already in her domain for the badge they need to use dive. On their way to Charlotte's gym, the player sees Hardy and Saphira in front of the barrier, with Hardy loudly demanding that Meteor show themselves. The person who does eventually approach the other side of the barrier is none other than Fern, who has joined what he deems to be the winning side in Team Meteor, and proceeds to relentlessly taunt his former classmate. Inside the gym, the player finds Charlotte attempting to console Laura, who for no apparent reason has been kicked out of the Elite Four. Laura flees, not wanting the player to see her sobbing, and Charlotte explains that apparently her sister has already been replaced, which confuses her because that's not generally how the process works, according to her. It's highly implied based on prior events that Elias has pulled some strings to get Laura fired, in a power play so he can place his apprentice of sorts, Bennett, into the Elite Four instead. Charlotte then leaves, presumably to go after Laura, while the player goes back to the barrier where Saphira and Hardy are. Sirius emerges dragging Aya and gives the player an ultimatum, Either the player hands over the ruby ring in their possession, or Aya dies. Saphira advises the player to ignore Sirius's demands, while Hardy begs both of them to just give him the ring. Which makes sense given that at this point, the Orphanage group knows the true value of the ring and the other keys, while the Onyx Academy group doesn't. Charlotte then arrives and puts on an act to save Aya. She pretends to be upset at Saphira for being willing to trade a life, which could have just as easily been her own sister's instead, for a mere ring, before angrily snatching the ring from the player and offering to trade it to Team Meteor instead at a given location before running off. This prompts Sirius to retreat without killing his hostage, and the player then races to the city's exit to find Charlotte there to explain her ploy. Charlotte then explains that Anna told her about Ametrine and offers to battle the player for the badge they need. On their way back to the gym, the player sees Saphira threatening Dr. Connell, who has briefly approached her from the other side of the barrier. The player defeats Charlotte for their 11th badge and proceeds with Shelly to Ametrine City. Along the way, the player manages to find and defeat the source of the ice blockade, a pulse Avalug. The player and Shelly investigate Ametrine City with regards to Heather's whereabouts, and learn of a supposed guardian angel delivering food to the city's residents during the food crisis, who is most likely Heather herself. During their investigation, the player and Shelly find an abandoned house with a diary detailing the origins of Zell. As it turns out, two of Zell's parts, Eve and Lumi, were sisters living in Ametrine, with Eve being responsible for the creation of the pulse machine, intending to use it to cure her younger sister's disease. As she was working on the Pulse project, the Team Meteor Agent Zero visited their home to threaten and coerce Eve into handing over the eventual results of her project. Zero then supervised Eve in her progress on the Pulse, until one day the machine went haywire during experimentation on the Magneton, forcing it to evolve and trapping Eve and Lumi in Zero's body in a chain reaction, creating Zell. Shelly is interrupted while reading the diary by a man with blue hair. Shelly asks the man if she's seen a young girl with pink hair, describing Heather. The man denies this before leaving. Shelly, concluding that the information on Heather is being intentionally kept from them, questions one of Ametrine's children further about the Guardian Angel. Shelly learns that the Guardian Angel and Heather are indeed the same person, and also that the reason everyone in the city was so secretive about this was because Heather was afraid of Blake finding out about her delivering food. Shelly and the player are then directed to where Blake lives, where the two trainers head to find Heather. There, the duo find the blue-haired man from earlier, identifying him as Blake. Blake refuses to reveal where Heather is, and instead demands the ruby ring from the player in exchange for that information, and the Waterfall TM, which also identifies him as being in affiliation with Team Meteor. In the end, Blake gets his hands on the ruby ring either way, by stealing it from the player or by the player handing it over, before leaving. Shelly and the player proceed to search for Heather once again, and run into Cal. Cal and Shelly briefly make up, and then Cal proceeds to inform them that his older brother has already called in backup, and that Team Meteor will soon arrive by air to retrieve Blake and the ruby ring at Ametrine Mountain. Cal also tells Shelly and the player where Blake probably has Heather locked up. Cal departs to prepare for Team Meteor's arrival and to confront his older brother, while Shelly and the player go rescue Heather. Shelly, upon finding where Heather is being kept, encourages her friend to the point where she has the will to speak again, as well as the will to rejoin the fight against Team Meteor to retrieve her mother's ring. Heather, now free, then takes the disguise to fight, while Cal, the player, and Shelly fight the incoming Team Meteor mooks on the ground, eventually making it to the summit of Ametrine Mountain and ultimately preventing Blake from delivering the ring to a helicopter with Solaris inside. Along the way, if the player didn't receive Waterfall from Blake earlier, the Team Meteor mook who watched Sirius kill their partner in Route 3 will approach you and give you the TM instead. Blake escapes via the helicopter with Solaris and Team Meteor, but Heather and Cal manage to retrieve the ruby ring successfully from him before his retreat, returning the ring to its rightful owner. Right before the helicopter leaves, Shelly questions Blake about a gate city and the sleep signal supposedly in Ametrine, to which Blake responds that he had no idea about that and departs with Solaris. Heather and Shelly head back to Ametrine City together to distribute food, leaving Cal to ask the player who told him about the sleep signal being in Ametrine, that person being Terra, prompting Cal to reveal that Terra is a member of Team Meteor and that he knows this from his own tenure of the organization. The player makes the long trip back to a gate circus alone to question Terra, and in her usual bizarre fashion, Terra doesn't even attempt to deny Cal's claims at all, instead admitting that she joined Team Meteor to quell her boredom. Terra then uses the computer nearby to somehow escape into a virtual world, resembling the first generation of Pokemon games, where the player must also enter and chase her down. The player manages to eventually engage Terra and battle her for their 12th badge, but little more, as Terra descends further into madness and the player as well as her fellow Triumvirate members decide to leave her in the virtual world and move on. Now having Waterfall and the badges to use it, the player returns to the waterfall where Amaria and Titania fell, and descends into the water treatment center to discover that Team Meteor has taken it over and kidnapped Amaria. Titania, at her wit's end after being stuck in the same place for so long, agrees to team up with the player to eradicate Team Meteor and save Amaria. The duo make their way through the water treatment center together, having multiple run-ins with Taka along the way, who conspicuously helps them reach their destination, which irritates Titania immensely because she's beginning to realize that Taka is living a life of contradictions, just like she was with Amaria. This is also the first occurrence of Team Meteor mooks appearing as New World cultists instead, hinting at Meteor's ultimate motives and driving home their relation to Elias's Arceus cult as well. The player defeats the Pulse Swalot currently sabotaging the center, before the two trainers reach Taka and Amaria. Taka explains to the two trainers that he's essentially bound to Team Meteor by being the son of Solaris, who he does care for, but in reality he wants no part in their deeds as a whole, resulting in Taka basically faking his loyalty as much as he can, without fully committing to either side of the conflict. He then asks the player to defeat him in battle before taking Amaria, who is unconscious, and the Sapphire bracelet from him, so that it looks like he tried to defend the center. While Titania, aggravated by Taka's lack of responsibility, tells the player to ignore him and let him face the consequences of his actions. The player's decision here will heavily alter the events near the end of the current game. After the player makes their choice and either battles Taka or refuses, Titania takes Amaria, the Sapphire bracelet, and leaves. The player follows Titania back to Fior Mansion, where they run into Julia and Florinia, who came to check on Titania and Amaria after witnessing them ascend the waterfall from Reborn City. Julia then gives the player Fly and instructs them to defeat Ciel in battle in order to use it to return to Reborn City, as it should be noted that ever since Kain and the player entered a Gate City, they've been cut off from Reborn due to not being able to go back the same way. However, before the player gets the chance to leave for a Gate Circus, the three trainers spot a Team Meteor helicopter, quite possibly the same one from Ametrine, descend upon Fior Mansion, and decide to rush over to defend it. The helicopter lands on the mansion's roof, where Sirius, Solaris, Fern, and Blake all prepare to infiltrate the mansion. Titania prioritizes protecting Amaria, who is still not conscious, in another room, leaving the player, Florinia, and Julia as the mansion's primary defense. The three fight off a wave of Team Meteor mooks before the higher-ups decide to make their entrance, pretending to hold Fern hostage in front of his sister. Sirius demands the Sapphire bracelet in exchange for Fern's life, but Florinia refuses to acquiesce, prompting Fern to drop the act and battle the player and her sister alongside Blake. If the player defeated Solaris on Mount Pyrus, then additional dialogue occurs after this battle between Fern and Florinia, giving Sirius an opportunity to incapacitate Florinia, and that leaves Julia to be your partner against Solaris and one of the New World Orderlies. If not, then Florinia will continue to be your partner for that battle as well. After defeating Solaris in the rematch, he reveals his last resort of having Sirius burn down the mansion altogether with a chandelure, prompting Sirius to allude to when he burned the orphan sister's house down. However, Titania prevents them from doing this by having her Excadrill create a fissure inside the mansion to reveal a vast pool of water from below, due to the manor also acting as Amaria's gym, which finally results in Team Meteor accepting temporary defeat and retreating, with Solaris commenting that they may have no choice but to involve Lyn at this point. Amaria then wakes up, and it becomes apparent that she's suffering from post-trauma amnesia, causing her to forget recent events, including discovering that Titania doesn't love her, which greatly upsets Titania and causes her to excuse herself. Florinia then decides to go help the resistance effort in Calcinon to correct Fern, while Julia decides to stay and take care of Amaria. After getting over her frustration regarding Amaria's amnesia, Titania informs the player that she'll be taking the Sapphire bracelet as far away from Team Meteor as she can think of. The player then goes back to a Gate Circus and defeats Ciel for their 13th badge, enabling them to fly back to Reborn City, which they find has been completely restored in their absence thanks primarily to the efforts of Adrian, the gender-neutral gym leader who was frozen in time until the player found them back during their campaign against Elias. The player visits the Grand Hall for the first time in a good while, finding Amethyst there, seemingly accepting Bennett into the Elite Four, and commenting on Laura's apparent resignation. Amethyst then asks you to gather Victoria, who has returned to the city, Adrian, who has reprised his role as the Fairy Gym leader, and someone named DJ Arclight, who was previously in charge of monitoring illegal Pokemon trafficking in 7th Street. Once the player has gathered all 3 trainers for Amethyst, she informs the group that she'd like their assistance in infiltrating a suspicious Devon Corporation location in Obsidian Ward after it came to her attention that Devon's Reborn branch doesn't even exist. Amethyst then tells the group that she needed their help because her investigation revealed that not only is the Devon building actually a Team Meteor base, but that Lyn is currently there right now. She then reveals her position as the champion of the Reborn League before laying out the infiltration plan to the party. Adrian and Amethyst will enter the building from the front under the guise of being there for city restoration business, while DJ Arclight, Victoria, and the player enter from underground. It doesn't take too long into the operation before Team Meteor reveal themselves, and the 3 trainers down below begin battling their way up. Victoria is particularly vicious in her assault of the Team Meteor mooks, evidence of her grudge from the events on Mount Pyrus. The trio eventually make it to the ground floor, but end up losing track of Amethyst and Adrian. Undeterred, they continue to descend into the base anyway, only to trigger a series of traps that separate the party one by one, until the entire infiltration team ends up captured. Lyn then appears via a monitor and decides to amuse herself by pitting her captives against each other and forcing them to battle, allowing the winner to go free while the loser is subjected to some kind of torture. The player defeats Victoria and Arclight in these battles and continues forward to witness Amethyst in her battle against Lyn. Amethyst loses and is beheaded by Lyn's Hydreigon as a result. Lyn stands over the corpse saying that the heart of Reborn is dead before leaving. At the end of the Team Meteor base, the player finds Zell, panicking over losing control over Pulse Magnezone. The player ends up battling Zell and the Magnezone, defeating both. Magnezone's defeat causes Eve and Lumi's psyches to leave Zero's body, presumably only leaving Zero behind alive. Zero goes into shock over being left alone by his 2 perpetual partners before deciding he needs to head to a gate and rushing off. The player then manages to free Victoria, Arclight, and Adrian, and the group reflects on Amethyst's death and the bizarre series of events within the base before deciding to leave to continue rebuilding Reborn in Amethyst's memory. After running some errands for them, Adrian agrees to battle the player for their 14th badge, and after their defeat, advises the player to use the newly rebuilt Peridot train station to make their way to Tourmaline Desert to pursue their next badge from Titania as well as help defend the key she carries. After arriving in Tourmaline Desert, depending on the choice made at the water treatment center, the player either travels across the desert alone, or with Taka, who has decided to quit Team Meteor and join the player. With or without him, the player makes it to a humble settlement in the far reaches of the desert scrapyard, Train Town, which also serves as the entrance to Titania's fantastical refuge, which includes a castle in the sky serving as her gym. If the player had Taka with them, he presumably stays behind in Train Town to settle down. However, it turns out that the castle is under invasion by Lyn, as she knocks you out at one point and confines you to one of the castle's towers. If Taka quits Team Meteor, he ends up following the player into Titania's realm, and calls out to them after Lyn confines him higher up in the same tower. The player then proceeds further into Titania's realm, and finds the gym leader herself, who seems to have escaped from Lyn. She gives the player the sapphire bracelet, then tells them that she has a plan to stop Lyn, before going back to try and find her again. The player continues into a cave deeper within Titania's realm, and finds Lyn. In both variations of this confrontation, Titania eventually manages to land a surprise attack from her Aegislash, mortally wounding Lyn. But in the version with Taka, she also kills Taka by accident, who was probably being manipulated by Lyn. In both variations, she also proceeds to double tap on Lyn's corpse to make sure she's dead. If she didn't kill Taka, she'll be relieved that it's all over before agreeing to battle the player for their 15th badge. But in the version where she kills Taka, Titania expresses extreme guilt over it and resolves herself to continue the good fight as a means to atone despite Lyn seemingly no longer being a factor. However, in both versions, after the player defeats Titania, Lyn miraculously reappears, taunting the 2 trainers that steel will not make her bleed. Oddly enough though, she lets the player keep the sapphire bracelet, in an attempt to breed distrust among her enemies before disappearing. Titania sternly warns the player against betrayal before telling them to meet her back at Fior Mansion, where the player is set to get their next badge from Amaria. If Taka didn't quit Team Meteor, and therefore Titania didn't kill him, she'll appear inside Amaria's gym already when the player arrives, and tells them to search for the water-type gym leader in her aquatic labyrinth. When talking to Amaria in the labyrinth, it becomes apparent that her memories are starting to come back, including her knowledge that Titania doesn't actually love her, but after considering that she's here with her right now, she decides she'd still be content if Titania is willing to keep up the facade, even with that knowledge. When she returns to the arena where Titania is waiting for her, Titania reassures Amaria that she'll stay by her side to protect her from Team Meteor, cheering her up, before taking her leave so that the player can battle Amaria, although it's equally as likely that Titania left to vent her frustrations outside. If Titania killed Taka, however, the situation changes substantially. Because Titania takes the time to tend to Taka's corpse, the player arrives in Fior Mansion before her to a manic, depressive, and obsessive Amaria who believes Titania is going to abandon her, and that the player is at fault. She goes as far in this variation as trying to drown the player in the labyrinth, who is saved by Titania when she finally arrives. Titania, disgusted and livid at Amaria and her actions, decides to break off the relationship and leave for good, regardless of what may happen as a result. From there, the player battles a more unhinged Amaria for their 16th badge. On the player's way out of Fior Mansion in both variations, Julia appears to inform them that according to Florinia, who just called Julia, the player's assistance is sorely needed back in Calcenon City. And that's everything that has happened in Pokemon Reborn so far. Alright, so I don't usually ask this of my subscribers or my viewers because I think it's corny as fuck, but this is probably the video that I've put the most effort into ever. My voice is literally shot. I fucking killed myself getting the audio for this video together. So if you made it to the end, go ahead and click that like button. Go ahead and subscribe. And I hope you enjoyed.